Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun had barely risen, but the compound of the Nwankwo estate was already a flurry of activity. A sea of black and gold tents swayed gently in the breeze as mourners began to arrive. The air was heavy with grief, or so it seemed. At the center of it all was Linda Nwankwo, dressed in a custom black lace gown, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She clutched a silk handkerchief, dabbing at dry eyes as she moved from guest to guest with calculated grace. Her sobs at the church were dramatic, her fainting spell by the casket well-timed. Inside, however, her heart was calm, almost giddy. Finally, she whispered to herself as she stared at the casket. Everything is mine now. Pa Nana sat quietly by a corner, dressed in a simple white senator and black cap. His cane rested against his knees, and his face bore no tears, just silent sorrow. Nobody paid him much attention. Even his seat, distant from the front row, said it all. He was the late Jude's father, but Linda had made sure he was barely visible. That evening, after the crowd had thinned and the band's drums had faded, Linda walked into the mansion as if it were her stage. She glanced at the walls, the chandeliers, and the imported furniture with the eyes of someone ready to redesign it all. "Remove every picture that has him in it," she ordered one of the housekeepers. "I don't want to see tears on these walls anymore." Pa Nana, slowly walking with the aid of his cane, approached the living room with quiet grace. He stood by the doorway, observing her bark commands like a general. "Linda," he said gently, "I'd like to speak with you, maybe tomorrow, when your heart is less heavy." She didn't turn. "What about Papa?" she said coldly. "The man is dead. We'll all be fine." That night, Pa Nana approached the room he'd been sleeping in, his son's guest room. To his surprise, the door was locked. A steward whispered apologetically, "Madam said that room is no longer available. You'll have to manage the boys' quarters for now, sir." Pa Nana simply nodded. He had buried his son today. He didn't have the strength to protest. Later that night, Linda invited two of her friends over. They popped wine in the master bedroom and laughed as if a wedding had just happened. "You did it, babe," one of them whispered. "CEO wife turned CEO herself." Linda smiled and twirled in front of the mirror. "This house is mine. Everything in it. I suffered with Jude. I earned this." But just outside, under the dim yellow of the porch light, Pa Nana sat quietly on a plastic chair, staring into the sky. The soft wind ruffled his gray beard. He heard the laughter. He heard the clinking of wine glasses. And though no one asked for his thoughts, he had many. This was the home he built, the legacy he handed over to his only son. And now, the woman who had once called him daddy had locked him out. But he said nothing. Not yet. 3 years before the funeral, in a quiet study lined with books and ledgers, Jude and his father had sat over a table filled with property deeds, account statements, and share certificates. Jude, dressed in a crisp white shirt, had his sleeves rolled up and sweat across his brow. "Papa, these are too many things for you to be managing at your age," he had said. "Scribbling signatures were necessary. Let me handle them. I'll protect them. You rest." Pa Nana, then a vibrant 72-year-old, had smiled fondly at his son. "You've always been responsible, Jude. I trust you." What Jude didn't know was that his father had never signed full ownership to him. The documents bore clauses that maintained Pa Nana as the legal owner of every company, estate, and asset. Jude was the manager, the executor, but not the heir. The only other person aware of this arrangement was the family's long-serving lawyer, Barrister Keene. "Keep this between us," Pa had said. "Not even his wife should know." And so it was. In the final days before his death, Jude had become increasingly anxious. He had sensed Linda's growing detachment. She no longer kissed him goodnight, and whenever he tried to talk about the future or starting a family, she changed the subject. One day, sitting on the same couch where he once learned to read as a boy, Jude looked at his father and asked, "Do you think she'll be okay without me?" Pa Nana didn't answer immediately. He was never one to speak quickly. "She's beautiful, ambitious, and strong," Pa finally said. "But love is different from loyalty. You must be sure she loves you, not what you offer. Jude lowered his gaze. That's why I want you to look after her. If anything ever happens to me. Pa Nana nodded, but deep inside, his heart whispered otherwise. He had watched Linda closely for years, how her eyes sparkled when Jude bought her things, how her voice softened when he praised her in public, and how it hardened the moment she thought no one was watching. One evening, weeks before the car accident, Jude had wanted to update his will and transfer some legal powers to Linda. Let's put her name on the estate documents, he told Barrister Akeen. But when Pa Nana heard about it, he stopped the process. Not yet, he said firmly. Observe her a little longer. Jude reluctantly agreed. He loved his wife deeply, but even he admitted that her affection was selective. On the day Jude died, Pa Nana sat in his bedroom holding the untouched documents. His tears were not just for a son lost, but for the painful foresight that his son's final wish might become a nightmare. He folded the documents back into the drawer unopened and made a decision. He would not give out a will, yet. To outsiders, Linda Nwankwo was the model daughter-in-law, respectful, graceful, and loving. Whenever guests visited the Nwankwo mansion, she would kneel to greet Pa Nana, serve him food personally, and joke about how he spoiled his son too much. Jude would smile proudly, holding her hand like a trophy. Isn't she just perfect? He once whispered to his father. But once the guests left and Jude was out of sight, Linda's mask would slip. You've eaten, haven't you? She snapped one evening when Pa Nana asked for an extra slice of fish. You old people just eat and wait to die. He had said nothing. That night he went to bed early, half from sadness, half from shock. From then on, he noticed the change. No more greetings in the morning, no more shared dinner conversations. Only silence or sharp commands. Once, when Jude traveled for a business trip, Pa Nana had suffered a dizzy spell. He stumbled in the hallway and fell. Linda stood over him, phone in hand. Are you going to get up, or should I call an ambulance and tell them a fossil collapsed in my house? She sneered. The driver eventually helped him up and carried him to the room. When Jude called that night, Linda spoke sweetly. Papa is doing well, oh. We made vegetable soup together. He's laughing so much today. Pa Nana listened from the door. Her lies were so smooth, so polished. It dawned on him that Jude never truly knew who he married. And the longer he stayed silent, the more confident Linda became. The worst incident happened one afternoon when Linda's friends came visiting while Jude was out. They lounged in the living room, sipping fruit wine and gossiping. When Pa Nana walked past, she laughed and said loudly, "That's our relic in residence. I don't even know why my husband insists he stays here. If I had my way." Her friends burst into laughter. Pa Nana stood still for a moment, then walked quietly back to his room. That night, Amarachi found him sitting on the balcony, tears in his eyes. "I built this house," he whispered, "and now I'm a burden in it." Amarachi didn't know what to say. She only sat beside him in silence, her small hand gently covering his wrinkled one. In a mansion where wealth dripped from the ceilings and pride bloomed in every corner, Amarachi was invisible. She was the girl who swept the marble floors barefoot, who never spoke unless spoken to, who washed dishes long after midnight when the laughter had died down. But even from her position on the lowest rung, she noticed everything. She noticed how Pa Nana sat outside alone while everyone else dined. She noticed how the security men no longer helped him with his bags. She noticed how Madame Linda walked past him as if he didn't exist. One evening, while clearing dishes, Amarachi paused when she saw Pa Nana struggling to carry a food tray up the stairs. Without thinking, she set her plates down, rushed to him, and took the tray from his hands. "Let me help you, sir," she whispered. Pa Nana looked surprised, almost confused, as if kindness had become foreign. "Thank you, my daughter," he said softly, his eyes watering. From that day on, Amarachi began sneaking him little favors: hot tea, clean towels, extra blankets. And with each act, a bridge quietly began to form between the forgotten patriarch and the unseen servant. It wasn't long before Pa Nana began to open up. They would sit under the almond tree by the backyard every evening, and he would talk, softly, slowly, as though releasing decades of quiet. He told her stories of his childhood in a village where his first job was cutting palm fruit. He spoke of how he built his first shop from selling scraps, how he raised Jude alone after his wife died of childbirth complications, and how every brick in the mansion had come from his sweat. Amarachi listened with reverence, often sitting cross-legged on the ground, her chin resting on her palms. One day, Panana chuckled mid-sentence and said, "You remind me of my wife, quiet but strong. She always said, 'The one who serves in love is the one who rises with honor.'" Amarachi blushed, unsure how to respond. She didn't see herself as anything but a poor housemaid trying to survive. But Pa Nana did. He saw something in her that no one in that house cared to see. Humility wrapped in grace. And as he sat there watching Linda strut past him with her gold-plated phones and glittering gowns, he smiled bitterly and whispered, "Let her keep playing queen. The crown knows who to sit upon." Amarachi's kindness did not go unnoticed by Linda, either, but not in the way one might hope. One morning, after Linda caught her helping Pa Nana trim his nails, she yanked Amarachi by the arm and hissed, "Are you here to serve or seduce?" Amarachi, startled, replied meekly, "He's old enough to be my grandfather, madam." But Linda's face twisted with venom. "Don't pretend to be innocent. If I catch you near him again, you'll leave this house barefoot." From that day, Amarachi became more cautious, but never stopped. She would slip food under the door, lay clean sheets quietly on his bed when no one watched, and sweep his room when Linda was at her spa appointments. To her, Pa Nana was not just her employer's father. He was a man who had loved, built, and lost. He was a man abandoned in his own palace. She couldn't change the world, but she could change his evenings. And she did. It started gradually, like a crack crawling across a mirror. With Jude buried and forgotten, Linda stopped pretending. She no longer greeted Pa Nana in the mornings, no longer asked how he was feeling, no longer even pretended to be cordial in front of the staff. One Saturday, while hosting a brunch with her circle of widowed and divorced friends, she laughed loudly and said, "Some people are just waiting to die. I'm surprised the old man hasn't dropped yet." The room erupted in giggles, even as one maid nearby choked back tears. That evening, Pa Nana sat by the stair railings with a newspaper. As Linda walked past, he greeted softly, "Good evening." She paused, looked at him from head to toe, and said, "Must you always be seen? You're not a sculpture. Go and sit in the garden or something." Pa Nana lowered his paper slowly, looked at her with sad, weary eyes, and simply nodded. That night, he didn't eat dinner. Amarachi found him sitting on a stool by the generator room. When she asked why, he said, "It's quieter here. My memories don't shout in the dark." From then on, her treatment worsened. She instructed the cook to stop preparing separate meals for old people, and ordered that Pa Nana begin eating what the maids ate, if there was enough left. She banned him from receiving visitors and told the guards, if anyone asks to see him, tell them he no longer lives here. Pa Nana, who once signed multi-million naira contracts in his own office upstairs, now sat by a small plastic table in the kitchen corridor. He stopped speaking during dinner time. He no longer walked freely in his own compound. One afternoon, when he asked if the driver could take him to the pharmacy, Linda waved him off and said, "You have legs. Walk." Amarachi was the only one who took him there the next day on her off day, paying the transport fare from her savings. Even then, Pa Nana never lost his calm. "It's in the storm that you truly see what floats and what sinks," he told her. But Amarachi noticed that his shoulders now slumped a little more, and his hands trembled when he lifted his tea. The final mask fell the day Linda hosted a pool party in Jude's memory, an event Pa Nana found deeply insulting. Loud music blasted through the mansion, and the poolside was littered with young men, bikini-clad ladies, and endless trays of alcohol. As he walked past, someone poured champagne over his head as a joke. Linda stood on the balcony and laughed. "Oops. Our ancient artifact got baptized," she said between sips of wine. That night, Pa Nana walked into the mansion and stood at the center of the living room as the last of the guests cleared out. He looked at Linda and said in a calm, trembling voice, "This house has lost its soul." Linda replied, "Then maybe it's time you left with yours." The next morning, the sun rose quietly over the mansion. It was a peaceful dawn, but not for long. Pa Nana entered the dining room, where Linda sat alone in silk robes, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. He stood beside the table, his voice gentle but firm. "Linda," he began, "I know you are grieving. We all are. But your choices, the lifestyle, the people you bring in, the things you say, this isn't how Jude would want his legacy remembered." She didn't look up. He continued, "You have the power to do something good with what he left behind. Don't destroy it." Linda placed her cup down slowly, lifted her head, and stared at him with icy amusement. "Did I ask for a sermon?" she spat. "Is this your church? Am I your congregation?" Pa Nana's eyes didn't waver. "I built this place with my hands," he said. "I watched my son grow it with wisdom. But I will not stand here and watch you turn it into a circus." Her chair screeched as she stood. "You will watch nothing," she barked, "because you're leaving." She marched to the sitting room and shouted for the guards. 2 large men in black walked in. "Escort this man off my property," she ordered. "He no longer lives here." The men hesitated, confused, unsure. "But Madam, one began. "Do it," she screamed, "unless you want to join him." Pa Nana stood quietly, his cane in one hand, his hat in the other. The guards approached, gently at first, but firm. "Please, sir," one said, "let's go." Linda followed, spewing venom. "You think this house is your retirement home? You leech. You parasite. I should have thrown you out when Jude died." She pushed his bag toward him with her foot. "Now crawl back to whatever grave you came from." The compound staff stood frozen, too afraid to speak. As the gates swung open and Pa Nana was let out, Amarachi ran barefoot from the backyard, her apron still tied. "Sir." "No. You can't do this," she cried. He turned, smiled faintly, and said, "Don't worry, my daughter. The sky may forget the rain, but the ground remembers." As the gates slammed behind him, Linda turned and spat on the ground. "Good riddance," she muttered. She walked back into the mansion, threw herself onto the living room couch, and picked up her phone. "Finally," she said, "now I can live." But she had no idea that the man she had just thrown out was the only person who held the key to her continued comfort. He wasn't just an old relic of a past generation. He was the true owner of everything she thought she had inherited. And the fall from her throne had only just begun. The sun was already high when Pa Nana was led to the front gate like an unwelcome guest. He held his cane with trembling dignity, one bag in his other hand, containing little more than a few clothes and a worn family photograph. He paused at the threshold of the massive iron gates that bore the Nwankwo family crest, once a symbol of pride, now a reminder of exile. Linda stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, still wearing her silk robe, a glass of wine in one hand. "You can take your pitiful legacy and go rot in the village," she sneered. "You were only here because Jude pitied you. He's gone now, and so is your purpose." Her words cut like acid. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to push him out or protect him. But Pa Nana gave a quiet nod and walked on his own. He said nothing. He didn't plead, didn't curse. There was no drama, just heartbreak, silenced by years of wisdom. He stopped for a moment outside the gates, placed his hat on his head, and took a breath. The air outside his own compound felt colder. Amarachi, who had been sweeping the backyard when the shouting started, ran to the front in time to see him being let out. Her heart raced in disbelief. She dropped her broom, kicked off her slippers, and ran barefoot down the driveway. "Papa," she shouted. "No, please." Pa Nana turned, his face calm, but his eyes held sorrow too deep for words. "It's all right, my daughter," he said as she reached him. "The tree may be pushed from its roots, but the soil will remember where it stood." Tears filled Amarachi's eyes as she held his bag. "You won't sleep outside," she whispered. "Not while I'm here." And so she led him around the back of the compound, to the humble servant quarters. Her room was barely large enough for 2 people. The fan barely worked, and the mattress was thinner than comfort allowed. But to Pa Nana, it was the first place in the mansion that felt like home since Jude's death. "Here," she said, placing water by his side. "You rest. I'll bring food." And as the afternoon passed, and Linda played music in the living room as if nothing had happened, the true king of the house lay resting in the corner of a servant's quarters. For weeks, Pa Nana remained hidden from the main house. Amarachi continued her duties as though nothing had changed, but every night she returned to care for him, bathing his feet, massaging his knees, helping him dress, and offering quiet companionship. Not once did he complain. Not once did he express hate. Instead, he would sit outside in the evenings, whispering prayers over the estate he once ruled. "May the house not burn, even if the fire dances close," he'd mutter. One day, Amarachi asked, "Why don't you fight back? Why don't you tell everyone who you really are?" He smiled gently and said, "Sometimes, to know what lives in a heart, you must let it act freely. She has shown me hers. That's enough." Amarachi watched him with growing admiration. He was a man not driven by revenge, but by truth, and she knew then that this story was far from over. From her bedroom balcony, Linda couldn't see Pa Nana anymore, and she liked it that way. To her, the compound felt lighter, freer, now that the ghost of tradition had been exorcised. She began to wear brighter makeup, bolder dresses, and laugh louder than ever. Her grief was now costume jewelry, worn for public sympathy, but discarded when convenient. Without her husband or his overbearing father around, she felt like a lioness unleashed. She redecorated the master bedroom, removed every portrait of Jude, and converted his home office into a cocktail lounge. To outsiders, she was simply moving on. But inside the house, those who served knew the truth. Grief hadn't changed her. Power had revealed her. Ma Esther, the long-serving cook, muttered under her breath, "God is watching this woman." The house had grown cold, not because of weather, but because its soul had been evicted. Meanwhile, behind the compound, Amarachi did everything to make Pa Nana comfortable. She cleaned, cooked, and even used her personal money to buy him mild painkillers for his arthritis. Sometimes he would smile and say, "You're doing too much for a man who has nothing." But she always replied, "You are not nothing, sir. You are someone." They had no fanfare, no satin sheets or marble floors. But there was peace in the servant quarters that hadn't existed in the main house for years. Every night, Pa Nana would sit outside on an old plastic chair and watch the sky. "This house has changed," he said one night. "Not in the walls, but in the spirit that walks within it." Amarachi nodded, understanding more than he expected. She had seen what Linda had become, but she also saw what she feared. The staff who once murmured in secret now walked with bowed heads, afraid of losing their jobs. Linda had become not just queen of the house, but tyrant of their silence. Then came the parties. What started as small gatherings became lavish poolside spectacles. Linda began inviting younger men, smooth-talking boys who laughed at all her jokes and kissed her hand like she was royalty. Music blasted through the walls. The air reeked of wine and cologne, and trays of roasted meat and expensive champagne circulated as if there were no tomorrow. Amarachi watched from her window as half-dressed women danced around the pool Jude had built for future children. She wept silently. Pa Nana, too, watched from the corner of the compound, eyes heavy with sorrow. "This is what his memory has become," he said. "A stage for clowns." One night, after the last guest staggered out drunk, Linda walked into the living room, threw off her shoes, and laughed. "I haven't felt this alive in years." But in the quiet room behind the compound, Amarachi covered Pa Nana with a blanket and said a silent prayer. Let truth not sleep forever. It was the fourth party in 2 weeks, and Linda was already drunk by sundown. Dressed in a short silver gown that sparkled beneath the garden lights, she danced with reckless abandon, arms flailing as music from hired DJs filled the air. Her laughter echoed across the compound, bouncing off the very walls that once hosted Jude's memorial service. The guests, mostly influencers, upcoming artists, and jobless charmers, worshipped her like a goddess of opulence. "This woman no day dullo," one of them cheered as Linda climbed onto a lounge table and popped a bottle of wine. "To freedom," she screamed. But in the shadows, watching through the slats of a wooden fence, sat Pa Nana with Amarachi beside him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He only watched. Amarachi wanted to look away, but she knew that truth sometimes came dressed in disgrace. "This is who she truly is," she whispered. "And she thinks no one sees." Pa Nana finally spoke. The fool's dance is always loudest before the drums break. By now, the staff was operating on fear. Ma Esther had resigned after Linda slapped her for burning stew. The cleaner had been replaced twice in 1 month. Guards no longer saluted Pa Nana at the gate. They had been ordered not to speak to him. Linda was losing herself in her fantasy world, a world where no one questioned her, where youth and attention masked the truth. Her accounts were still working. The businesses were still funding her lifestyle. But behind the scenes, the gears were turning. The lawyer, Barrister Keen, had begun preparing paperwork, auditing accounts, and quietly watching her expenses. Linda had no clue. To her, the house was hers. The businesses were hers. The legacy was hers. She even began referring to herself as the Nwankwo matriarch on social media. But every night, in a dimly lit room behind the estate, Pa Nana wrote in a leather-bound notebook, recording everything. Every party, every insult, every action. "Let history not forget," he said to Amarachi, who brought him food in silence. Then came the day she posted a video online, dancing in the mansion's hallway in revealing clothes, while drinking straight from a bottle. "When your husband dies, but you inherit the good life," the caption read. It went viral. The video reached people who once respected Jude. It reached clients, friends, board members. But more importantly, it reached Barrister Keen, who had spent the last few weeks compiling evidence that would soon change everything. Meanwhile, Linda partied on, oblivious. Oblivious to the fact that the empire she thought was hers was built on a truth she had rejected, and a man she had thrown out. And as she toasted once again to freedom, Amarachi closed the window, turned to Pa Nana, and said, "It won't be long now, sir." He nodded slowly, eyes on the stars. The sun always sets, even on queens who forget the crown isn't theirs. Barrister Keen had known the Nwankwo family for over 3 decades. He had drafted the original business registration documents for Pa Nana when the old man was still selling building materials in ABA. He had overseen the expansion into Lagos, the formation of the export wing, and even Jude's wedding contract with Linda. But as much as he had respected Jude's love for his wife, he had never trusted Linda's eyes. Too sharp, too calculating. When he received a forwarded clip of Linda drunkenly twerking by the pool with champagne in hand, Keen closed his laptop slowly and sat back in his leather chair. "So, it has begun," he muttered. He picked up the thick folder he'd been assembling for weeks. Photos, bank statements, estate documents, surveillance screenshots, even handwritten notes from Pa Nana. Everything was in order. All that remained was the right moment to act. But first, he decided, she needed a warning. A final chance. He arrived at the mansion unannounced, dressed in a modest navy blue kaftan, holding a brown envelope and a calm face. The guards hesitated at first, but eventually allowed him in, recognizing the man who had overseen the property for years. Linda was lounging on a deck chair in her bikini robe, her face hidden behind sunglasses, her nails being painted by a guest. "What now?" she groaned when she saw him. Keen sat down slowly, refusing the glass of wine offered. "I came to speak as a family friend," he began. "Not as a lawyer." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Speak quickly. I have a spa appointment in 30 minutes. Keen remained calm. "This home, these businesses, they are not what you think. There are documents, signatures, original titles that—" She cut him off, laughing. "Spare me the riddles, old man. Everything here is mine. I bury Jude. I run the accounts. What's yours to say?" Keen took a breath. "Respect the name you were given. It may be the only thing that still protect you." But she laughed louder, mocking his tone. "Save your breath, lawyer. I'm not one of your village widows. I've got money, and I've got time." Keen stood up slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers. "Enjoy your time, madam," he said, slipping the brown envelope onto her coffee table. "But remember, time is what reveals the truth." As he walked away, Linda opened the envelope lazily and flipped through the documents. Property deeds signed solely by Pa Nana. Company accounts with Jude listed only as director, not owner. And finally, a clause in Pa Nana's original ownership structure stating that no asset could be inherited by marriage without the patriarch's written will. Her face changed. She sat upright. "What the hell is this?" she shouted. But Ekeen was already out the gate. She stormed back inside, tossing the papers across the room. "That old fool thinks he can scare me," she hissed. "He has no power." But deep inside, for the first time since Jude's death, fear began to crack through her confident mask. Because if the documents were true, then everything she called hers was hanging by a thread, and the man she had kicked out still held the scissors. Before Jude's accident, before the casket and condolences, he had been the kind of husband many women prayed for. Though born into wealth, Jude never let money soften his values. He was thoughtful, gentle, and fiercely protective. Linda, in her early years of marriage, often bragged to friends about his devotion. He would cook for her on Sundays, sneak her handwritten notes during board meetings, and massage her feet while she watched her favorite shows. He even once took her on a surprise anniversary trip to Zanzibar, after overhearing her mention it during a random conversation. Jude adored her, and in public, their marriage looked perfect. But behind the scenes, there were cracks, small, hairline fractures that Jude began to notice. She never prayed with him anymore. She never asked about his father's health. She refused to visit his village, saying she was too refined for such dust. And worst of all, her respect for Pa Nana had quietly vanished. Jude tried to brush it aside at first. He excused it as stress or the difference in background. But it became harder to ignore when he returned from business trips to find his father isolated and quiet. "Are you all right, Papa?" he would ask, and Pa Nana would smile faintly. "I'm old, not dead," he'd say. "Don't worry about me." But the house no longer echoed with laughter when he and his father sat together. Linda found excuses to avoid family dinners. Once, Jude walked into the kitchen and overheard her scolding the cook for giving Pa Nana the last slice of beef. "That old man eats like he's feeding a ghost," she snapped. Jude froze. He didn't say anything that night, but he never forgot. A week later, he confronted her gently. "I heard you talking about Papa." She rolled her eyes and said, "Must I love everyone in your life? He's always here, always watching us." Jude replied softly, "He's my father. If you cannot honor that, how can I trust you to honor me when I'm gone?" That sentence hung between them for days. It was the first time Jude had ever questioned her loyalty out loud. The week before his death, he spent a long evening with Pa Nana in the study. "You were right," Jude whispered. "She's not who I thought she was." Pa Nana didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He only sighed and said, "It's not too late to teach her love." Jude nodded, but the sadness in his eyes lingered. That night, he began the process of transferring more power back to his father, not legally, but in preparation. "If anything happens to me, Papa," he said with tears in his eyes, "please don't let her destroy everything we built." Pa Nana placed a hand on his shoulder. "I won't," he promised. And when Jude left that room, he was resolved to have one last conversation with Linda, to give her one last chance. But that conversation never happened. A week later, his car veered off a wet expressway and flipped 3 times. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man who had held everything together was already gone. It started with a shopping spree at her favorite boutique. Linda had walked in with 3 friends, dragging 4 attendants behind her as she selected shoes, bags, and diamond earrings like they were candy. The total bill was over 1.7 million Nigerian nairas, and she didn't blink until the POS machine blinked red. "Declined," the cashier said politely. Linda laughed. "Try again." They tried 3 more times, same result. Her friends began to exchange uncomfortable glances. "Must be a network issue," Linda said with a forced smile. She called her bank manager, furious. "What's going on?" The response was careful but chilling. "There's been a temporary administrative freeze on your primary accounts, pending ownership confirmation from the board." Her heart stopped. "What board?" she shouted. "Who authorized this?" But the line had already gone cold. For the first time in weeks, Linda began to sweat, not from dancing, but from fear. She drove straight to the business headquarters, storming into the reception with fire in her eyes. "Where's my office key?" she demanded. The receptionist, once her obedient servant, hesitated. "There's a board meeting in progress, madam." Linda pushed past her and tried to enter the executive wing, but her fingerprint was no longer recognized. Security was called. She screamed, cursed, and cried, but all in vain. "This is my husband's company," she yelled. But one of the older security guards stepped forward and said quietly, "Ma, this company belongs to Chief Nana. Always has." She froze. Her face drained of color. "What did you say?" The man didn't repeat himself. Linda stood there, shoulders trembling, as realization began to settle like dust after storm. Everything, the mansion, the cars, the businesses, they were never legally hers. She had only been living off borrowed authority. And now that loan had expired. Returning home that day felt like a walk of shame. The household staff watched her more closely than before, sensing the shift in power. She no longer barked orders as loudly. She didn't call for the driver. She sat in the living room alone, clutching her phone, calling every contact she thought still cared. Some didn't answer. Others gave vague excuses. "We're praying for you," one said before hanging up. Even her so-called lovers, the boys she flaunted like trophies, stopped responding to her messages. The walls seemed to close in. The music in her playlists sounded like mockery. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked like royalty. She looked like a pretender, draped in labels she never paid for, seated in a throne that was never hers. And though the house still stood tall, Linda could feel the tremors beneath its foundation. Something was crumbling. Something she couldn't stop. The paper came in a plain white envelope, delivered not by a messenger, but quietly placed on the dining table by the family lawyer's assistant. Linda, in a red silk robe, was just coming down the stairs when she noticed it. Thinking it was another invoice or routine document, she tore it open without hesitation, only for her hands to begin shaking almost immediately. "Final notice of possession reclamation," it read. Her eyes darted across the page as she tried to make sense of the language. Terms like unauthorized occupancy, non-transfer of ownership, and official reclamation by legal title holder stared back at her like ghosts. She sat down, lips trembling. At the bottom of the letter was a deadline: 14 days. 14 days to leave the mansion. 14 days to surrender everything she had claimed. Her heart raced, and the document fell from her hand onto the polished marble floor like a dropped verdict. In a frenzy, she picked up her phone and dialed Barrister Ekine's number. No answer. She tried again, and again. On the fourth ring, the line finally opened. "What is this nonsense you sent me?" she demanded. "You can't just throw me out of my own house." His voice was calm, deliberate, and without a trace of emotion. "It was never your house, Mrs. Nwankwo. You were never listed on the property deed, nor were you ever registered as a shareholder in any of the businesses. The house, the land, the assets, all belong to Chief Nana." "Chief," she stammered. "You mean that old fool? That man, She stopped herself, but it was too late. "That man," Ekine continued, "who you publicly humiliated, verbally abused, and illegally evicted from the compound he built with his own hands. The board, under legal advice, has decided that your occupancy is unlawful. You have 2 weeks to vacate the premises. Kindly do not resist." Then he hung up. Linda screamed. She swept the plates off the table in a fit of rage, throwing her phone against the wall until it cracked. Her screams echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a curse. The few staff members who remained rushed in, but said nothing. They simply watched her break. She stormed into the kitchen, yelling at everyone to leave her sight. Then she slumped against the wall, weeping. For the first time since Jude's death, she felt truly alone. The friends had vanished, the lovers had fled, and the family she had built her arrogance upon was buried beneath her own pride. 14 days. 14 days to watch the house she redecorated, the bed she defiled, and the name she disgraced be stripped from her like a costume. She paced the living room all night, reading the eviction letter again and again. But no matter how many times she read it, One sentence stood out like a knife in her chest. The legal owner retains full authority over the estate. You, madam, do not. The truth hit harder than the eviction letter. It came in the form of a formal visit. 3 suited men from the firm of Ekin and Sons, flanked by a police escort, entered the compound unannounced. Linda, groggy and disheveled from a sleepless night, rushed outside in her slippers. What is this? Why are there police in my house? She barked. The lead man handed her a thick, manila envelope. We are here to serve a judicial clarification and execution of ownership. Linda tore the envelope open, only for her vision to blur as the truth unfolded. Every document bore Pa Nana's name: land deeds, business incorporations, bank statements, asset portfolios. Jude's name was listed only as administrator in trust, with no proprietary ownership attached. There was even a video recording from 2 years prior of Jude and Pa Nana discussing the estate with Barrister Ekin, confirming Jude was never the legal owner. It had all been a carefully guarded arrangement, a father safeguarding his legacy until the right time. Linda's knees buckled. She sat on the edge of the steps, clutching the documents like a drowning woman holding onto a plank. This can't be, she whispered. Jude told me. He said he was handling things. Yes, the lawyer replied calmly. Handling, not owning. He never transferred anything to you because he couldn't. He didn't have the authority. And now that Chief Nana is aware of the full extent of your actions, this, he gestured to the papers, is your consequence. The police were there not to arrest her, but to ensure that no documents were destroyed and that the locks could be changed if needed. Linda could barely speak. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She had built her arrogance on assumptions, on privilege, on charm. And now the foundation had vanished. Everything she had lorded over, every order she had barked, every insult she had flung, was aimed at the very man who still held the keys. Word spread quickly. The staff whispered it like wildfire. Chief Pa Nana owns everything. It was never Jude's to give. For some, it was vindication. For others, a quiet revelation. Amarachi, standing at the far end of the compound, watched as Linda's world unraveled. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply wiped her hands on her wrapper and returned to Pa Nana's room. It's done, she said quietly. Pa Nana nodded from his chair by the window. It had to be. He didn't celebrate either. There was no joy in watching someone fall, only the confirmation that the ground had always been there, waiting beneath their feet. I only wanted to know who she was when no one was watching, he murmured. Now I know. And just like that, the greatest secret in the house was no longer hidden. The throne she claimed was never hers. The evening breeze swept gently through the curtains of Amarachi's small room as Pa Nana sat beside a wooden table, staring at the blank pages of a new will. His hand, slightly unsteady from age and arthritis, held a pen that trembled but didn't falter. Barrister Ekin stood nearby, watching silently, his presence like that of a priest witnessing a confession. "You're sure about this?" the lawyer asked. Pa Nana didn't look up. "More sure than I've been about anything," he replied. "I've watched men build empires and watched women burn them down. But kindness builds what even bricks cannot." He motioned for Amarachi to come forward. She stepped in timidly, wearing the same faded wrapper and blouse she had worn the day he first entered her small servant room. "Me?" she asked, confused. "You're the one," Pa Nana said gently. "Not by blood, but by heart. And that's what matters." With steady breaths, he began to dictate. "I, Chief Silas Nana, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. I bequeath all my landed properties, including the estate located at Plot 7A, Lekki Phase 1, and all its contents, to Amarachi Okonkwo, the only person who cared for me when I had nothing. I also transfer primary control of Nana and Sons Trading Company to the legal trust under her name, effective immediately." Amarachi gasped. "Sir, I don't deserve this. I'm just a maid. I didn't do anything special." Pa Nana turned to her, tears glistening in his tired eyes. "You gave me dignity when the woman my son loved gave me shame. You gave me bread when she gave me insults. If that is not worth a legacy, Then what is? Ekin sealed the documents, placed the signature on record, and watched as Pa Nana pressed his thumbprint beside it. Outside, the house was silent. Linda sat in her room, unaware that the final nail had just been driven into the coffin of her greed. She had spent the day calling every contact she had, businessmen, lawyers, pastors. But no one could undo what was now written in ink and sealed by law. As the stars twinkled above the mansion that had once been hers in fantasy, Amarachi stood at the foot of the compound stairwell, unsure whether to cry or bow. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Pa Nana leaned back in his chair. "Now," he said, "we wait. And when she comes to kneel, you will know the difference between a woman who rules a house and one who earns it." The night passed quietly, and for the first time in a long while, Pa Nana slept with no weight on his heart. The mansion gates had never seemed so far away. Linda stood outside them now barefoot, her once luxurious robe now stained with dust and tears. Her makeup had run down her face from a night of weeping, and her wig hung awkwardly, revealing patches of unbraided hair. She had spent the last 24 hours calling everyone she could think of, politicians, pastors, old friends of Jude, but all her calls were either ignored or politely declined. "We didn't know the truth," some muttered, "and we don't want to be involved." Her accounts remained frozen, her eviction date stood firm, and her influence had evaporated. Now, with pride crushed under desperation, she found herself at the very gate she had once watched Pa Nana walk through with his head bowed. She remembered how she had told the guards not to let him back in, how she called him a relic, a parasite. And now she was on the outside. The guards, two new faces she didn't recognize, refused to open the gate without permission. "Please tell Papa I'm here," she begged. Tell him I'm sorry. I didn't know." The younger of the two guards gave her a look of sympathy, but said nothing. She dropped to her knees. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean it. I was hurt. I was confused." She sobbed loudly, her voice cracking with guilt and shame. After a long silence, one of the guards finally walked away. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Finally, the balcony curtain moved. A shadow appeared. It was Amarachi. She stepped out slowly, dressed in a clean, simple wrapper, her posture poised but unsure. Linda's eyes lit up. "Amarachi, please. Help me talk to him. I was wrong. I treated you badly. I treated him worse. But I've learned. Please." Amarachi didn't speak. She only stared down at the woman who once ruled over her with insults and entitlement. Then she turned and walked back inside. A few moments later, another figure emerged, Pa Nana. He leaned on his cane, his robe simple, but his presence like a mountain. Linda's tears flowed harder. Papa, I didn't know. I was stupid. I thought you were just... I thought." She couldn't finish the sentence. Pa Nana said nothing for a long moment. Then he walked to the edge of the balcony and looked down at her. "You threw me out like trash," he said, his voice clear despite his age. "Not once did you come back to ask if I ate. Not once did you ask how I was surviving. You mocked me to strangers. And now you ask for what? Forgiveness." Linda nodded, sobbing. Yes, Papa. I am sorry." He paused, then said quietly, "Forgiveness I can give. But trust has died in this house. And not even tears can resurrect it." Then he turned and walked away. The balcony curtain closed, and the gates remained shut. What Linda couldn't get through pity, she now tried to claim through war. Within days of her public humiliation at the gates, her tone changed. No longer was she the sobbing widow. She was now the scorned woman demanding justice. She called lawyers, filed petitions, and threatened to sue both Pa Nana and Barrister Ekin. "I was his wife," she cried in her office meeting with a newly hired attorney. "I deserve something. This is emotional manipulation. It's character assassination." But when her lawyer requested supporting documents, proof of ownership, power of attorney, transfer of assets, there was nothing. Not a single paper bore her name. Jude had never trusted her with legal access. Everything she had controlled was merely by proximity. She had lived in the mansion like a guest who mistook her room key for a title deed. Still, she pressed forward. Her desperation disguised itself as confidence. But the law does not bend to illusion. The courtroom drama lasted 3 weeks. Reporters hovered at the court entrance. Headlines read, "Widow battles patriarch over family fortune," and "Who owns the Nwankwo Empire?" Inside the courtroom, Linda looked polished but tense. Her makeup was flawless, her designer suit expensive, but her hands trembled every time she flipped through documents she barely understood. Pa Nana arrived quietly each day, escorted by Amarachi. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't grandstand. He sat with dignity, his silence louder than Linda's protests. One by one, the documents were reviewed. Jude's handwritten notes, the security camera footage of Linda's abuse, the verified property titles. Each one painted a portrait not of a misunderstood widow, but a woman whose entitlement had overridden basic humanity. When asked by the judge if she had any legal evidence tying her to the estate, Linda broke down and said, "I was his wife. Isn't that enough?" The judge replied calmly, "Love does not transfer legal ownership, and cruelty does not inherit compassion." On the final day of the trial, the verdict was clear. Linda had no claim. The estate, the company, and all properties legally and rightfully belonged to Chief Silas Nana. Furthermore, her actions, captured in video evidence, audio recordings, and witness testimonies, had violated tenant protections and human dignity laws, stripping her of even temporary occupancy rights. She was ordered to vacate the premises immediately and pay court fees for her baseless litigation. As she left the courtroom, surrounded by flashing cameras and murmurs, she tried to hold her head up, but there was nothing left to hold. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. The empire she once ruled with pride had closed its doors to her, and she now stood outside, not just as a widow without a will, but as a woman who lost everything because she never saw what mattered most. The day Amarachi was handed the keys to the Nwankwo mansion was unlike any other. There was no grand ceremony, no public announcement. It was a quiet transfer, attended only by Barrister Akeen, 2 trusted aides, and Pa Nana himself. As the lawyer pressed the brass keys into her trembling hands, Amarachi froze. She looked around the foyer of the house she had once swept barefoot. The walls still echoed with the distant memories of Linda's insults, of Jude's laughter, of staff who had come and gone under orders she was never meant to give. Now it was hers, not by ambition, but by grace. "I don't deserve this," she said, tears in her voice. But Pa Nana stood beside her, nodding gently. "Deserving isn't about being loud," he said. "It's about being present. You were present when everyone else walked away." Amarachi didn't move into the master bedroom right away. Instead, she restored the servant quarters and built a second house within the compound for aging staff who had once been dismissed without cause. She called back the loyal ones, Ma Esther, the driver, the gardener, and gave them their jobs again, along with better pay. The house that had once reeked of pride and mockery now filled with peace. She redecorated not with luxury, but with meaning. Photos of Jude smiling beside his father, artwork made by staff children, hand-woven curtains sewn by local widows. Slowly, the mansion became a home again. One evening, as she stood by the hallway window, Amarachi whispered to herself, "Not bad for maid, eh?" She chuckled through her tears. And for the first time in her life, she felt what power truly was. Not control, not fear, but the freedom to heal. Meanwhile, Pa Nana watched from his favorite seat in the garden, his body now more fragile, but his soul lighter than ever. He often sat in silence, humming old songs as the compound returned to life. When guests visited, they didn't ask for Madam anymore. They asked for Amarachi, now addressed as Madam Okonkwo. She remained humble, never flaunting her position, never seeking applause. One afternoon, she found Pa Nana asleep under the almond tree, a faint smile on his lips. She covered him with a soft shawl and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't stir. He didn't have to, because even in silence, the legacy was speaking. The house had found its true mistress, not the woman who shouted her name, but the one who served when no one was looking. The quiet that now filled the Nwankwo estate was not the same silence that once echoed with prideful emptiness. It was a peace that spoke of healing, of restoration. Amarachi had taken it upon herself to build something lasting, something bigger than a mansion with marble floors. She founded the Jude Nwankwo Foundation, in honor of the man whose kindness had given her a chance at life. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide scholarships to underprivileged children, offer shelter for homeless widows, and create jobs for those who had been forgotten by society. She poured her heart into the work, not for recognition, but to prove that love can bloom from ashes, that loyalty still has a place in a world obsessed with power. The public, upon learning the full story through the media, rallied behind her. Her humility, combined with her quiet strength, reminded them of something rare: goodness without agenda. Meanwhile, Pa Nana's health had begun to decline. The man who had once built empires with his bare hands now moved slowly, his breath shallow, his voice softer than before. But he was not afraid. Every evening, he sat on his cane chair in the garden and watched children play on the lawn, some of them from the families his foundation had helped. He would chuckle occasionally, whispering prayers under his breath. Amarachi remained by his side until the very end, often sitting at his feet like a granddaughter born of grace. One evening, as the sun set in golden hues across the compound, Pa Nana called her close. "You did what I couldn't," he said, placing his frail hand over hers. "You turned pain into purpose." That night, he closed his eyes and drifted peacefully, a smile on his face, as if reuniting with his beloved son Jude in a place where legacies are carved not in stone, but in memory. His burial was modest, as he had requested. No extravagant tents, no flamboyant guests. Just those who truly loved him, gathered beneath the almond tree where he once sat. Amarachi gave a quiet eulogy, her voice steady but tender. "He was not just a father," she said. "He was a mirror. He showed us who we are when no one is watching." The old staff wept. The children from the foundation held white roses. Even the neighbors who had once sided with Linda now stood with bowed heads, recognizing too late the worth of the man they had overlooked. And though there were no golden caskets or loud brass bands, Pa Nana's legacy was louder than ever. It echoed in the laughter of children, in the meals served to hungry mouths, in the home that no longer feared its past. He had not just passed on, he had passed something forward, and that was the greatest inheritance of all. The house on the opposite side of the estate gate had once been a quiet rental property, but it was now occupied by a woman barely recognizable. Linda sat by the window, her hair disheveled, her frame thinner, her once flawless skin faded with stress and shame. She had been forced to leave the Nwankwo mansion with only a suitcase and a name that now opened no doors. Her attempt to return to her old friends failed. None wanted to be associated with her disgrace. The lavish cars were gone. The attention had faded. Even her social media pages, once filled with filters and followers, were now barren of likes. The world had moved on, and she remained staring across the street at the home she once ruled. Every night, she watched as Amarachi walked the compound with grace. And every night, Linda whispered the same words under her breath: "That should have been me." But deep down, even she knew the truth. It wasn't meant to be her. She hadn't earned it, not with her arrogance, not with her cruelty, and certainly not with her entitlement. She remembered how she laughed when Pa Nana asked her to consider charity. She remembered how she mocked Amarachi's cheap shoes. And most of all, she remembered how she told Jude, on the day of their wedding, "Your father won't last much longer. Soon, we'll have it all to ourselves." Now, the shame of those words weighed more than the gold she once flaunted. Once, she had mocked the very people who now controlled her future. And now, all she could do was watch from behind cracked curtains. Occasionally, someone would pass by her rented house and whisper, "That's the one who lost everything." The words stung, but they were true. She had lost everything, because she never truly valued anything. One afternoon, Amarachi walked past Linda's gate on her way to the community food drive. Linda rushed to the window, their eyes meeting for the first time since the courtroom. Amarachi didn't smile. She didn't wave. She only nodded respectfully and walked on. That simple act pierced Linda more than insults ever could. Not hatred, not revenge, just quiet dignity. And in that moment, Linda realized Amarachi had not just taken the house. She had become the woman Linda never could. Strong without noise. Powerful without ego. Kind without weakness. As the sun dipped behind the Nwankwo estate, Linda curled up on her worn sofa, watching the mansion glow in the evening light. It was no longer her shadow stretching across the gate. It was Amarachi's. And for the rest of her days, Linda would live with the knowledge that the home she thought she inherited had been waiting for someone worthy all along. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.